Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Carver. I'm a product specialist here at Oculus. Welcome to today's clinical webcast, Dry Eye, a Simple Approach to In-Depth Understanding by Dr. Art Epstein, hosted by Dr. Barry Iden. A recording of this webinar will be sent out in the next week to all registrants. You have a text box on your GoToWebinar screen where you can enter questions. Please enter your questions during or immediately after the presentation, and we will have some time to discuss them at the end. And now, our host, Dr. Barry Iden.
Well, good afternoon. I'm Barry Iden, and it's going to be my pleasure and honor to serve you as moderator for this fabulous series of webinars, which are devoted to the topic of dry eye and ocular surface disease. I practice at a multi-specialty eye care practice located in the Chicago area, and I personally emphasize the management of ocular surface disease, irregular cornea, and other anterior segment diseases on a day-to-day basis. So I'm very excited to learn along with you as we hear from some of the most influential names in dry eye and ocular surface disease diagnosis and treatment. Next slide, please. I want to thank Oculus for their support of these series of webinars, and I want to review with you the webinars that are going to take place this week. This afternoon, we're starting out with Dr. Art Epstein, who's going to speak on Dry Eye Simple Approach to In-Depth Understanding, which is a new and evidence-based way to approach dry eye. Tomorrow evening, we'll have Paul Karpecki speaking about the DEWS-2 and the role of technology in dry eye, which is where he'll take the most respected and comprehensive review of dry eye and make that clinically applicable for all of the attendees. And then our final webinar on dry eye will take place Thursday evening, where Dr. Crystal Breimer will talk about cultivating compliance by building trust through education, which is such a critical element in achieving success in dry eye and ocular surface disease management. Next slide, please. I also want to bring to your attention a series of podcasts that have been put on and presented by Oculus called May I Interrupt? I had the pleasure of being part of one of these podcasts, and that'll be available for you to tune into this week. The first one was performed last week, and it was fantastic. It had Dr. Alan Glazer and Dr. Tom Arnold speaking about the use of social media. And then they did that surrounded by a theme of whiskeys and scotch, which was really exciting. For me, I was joined by Stephanie Wu, another specialist in advanced contact lens management, and we talked about specialty contact lens care, and that was surrounded by the theme of wine. So it was a blast to do, and I hope you'll enjoy. We had Craig Norman and Jason Jedlicka as our moderators, and we just had so much fun doing it. So be on the lookout for that. Next slide, please. So now I'd like to introduce our speaker for tonight. Art Epstein likely needs no formal introduction to the eye care professional community. He is one of the most widely known speakers and writers in eye care. Art is likely most known as the medical editor, chief medical editor, in fact, of the weekly online publication called Optometric Physician, where he shares his views on what's happening in eye care in his editorial column. Often controversial, but never disingenuous, thousands of eye care practitioners look forward to what Art will have to say each and every week. Art practices with his wife and what he would admit would be his better half, Shannon, in Arizona at Phoenix Eye Care and the Dry Eye Center of Arizona. He consults to numerous companies in the eye care field and is the former chair of the American Optometric Association's Contact Lens and Cornea section. Now, I can go on with Art's introduction, but we only have an hour for this webinar. So let me now introduce a true leader in our field, and more importantly, a dear friend of mine for well over 25 years, Dr. Art Epstein.
Thank you, Barry. That was a lovely introduction. And actually, Barry and I have known each other for quite some time, and I've actually been fortunate to be his friend. A little annoyed that I wasn't invited for the Scotch tasting podcast, but such is life. Anyway, for those of you who actually had to change your plans, I know I inadvertently created a conflict, and we're doing this a little earlier, so I apologize for that, and I'm glad you're able to make it. And I hope to be able to share a significant amount of insight that I've developed over the last couple of years. Some of you may have heard variations of this presentation, but I will tell you that literally not a week goes by where I don't figure out something new and something significant in terms of understanding dry eye disease and its management and its patients as well. So we have, as Barry mentioned, a practice. And actually, I exist within that practice. Phoenix Eye Care is an overarching entity. It's a 3-doctor OD practice, as is the case with many of you. We're shut down for routine patients. My better half is in seeing emergencies along with our young and fearless associate, and I am here speaking to you, and I only see dry eye patients. With rare exceptions, I see emergencies as well, but I focus primarily on dry eye. The basic premise of this presentation is that we have kind of worked our way up a tree of complexity to the point where most of us are checked out. We go, I don't get this. There's so much stuff going on. I don't know what to do. I give people tears. They don't get better. My patients are frustrated. A lot of people just don't like dry eye because they feel they can't be successful with it. The patients never get better. They're annoying. And it's frustrating. It's frustrating as a clinician. I think the most important thing is to understand what the experience is like for patients. And, here we have, one of my patients is, staring me right in the face. Very spooky feeling. We have some famous people whose lives have been turned upside down. If you're a Fox News watcher, and I imagine based on demographics, 62.7% of you are. You may have seen, just kidding, Shannon Bream, who's actually a quite competent newscaster, and her life was turned upside down, but what turned out to be recurrent corneal erosion syndrome that somebody misdiagnosed. But she does have an underlying dry eye issue and has become a bit of a spokesperson for dry eye. So for the average patient, dry eye starts as relatively mild discomfort, awareness of their eyes. I put it into 3 buckets: the discomfort bucket, which is primarily irritation, the grittiness, the burning, the dryness. We'll talk about the underlying causes. We'll see it sometimes as contact lens intolerance. If it gets bad, the eye tries to wash it away with epiphora. Severe dry eye presents often with photophobia, and for some people, they're literally incapacitated with pain. Sometimes you see patients, no clear refractive endpoint. We get patients referred in because of that, because of an unstable tear film. The tear film is the first interface between sight outside and refractive focus inside. So an unstable tear film will lead to an unstable visual experience. And we have patients who complain of redness, chronic redness. I had one woman who came in and I asked her why she was there. She said, I have dry eye. I said, so you feel uncomfortable? She said, no. I said, vision unstable? She goes, no. I said, what's the problem? She goes, I look like a vampire. I looked at her and actually she did. She actually did. She had very severe red eye, which we were able to manage by getting to the cause, which we'll talk about in detail. So, for us, here's, the confusion. We're just overwhelmed with, is it aqueous deficiency? Is it evaporative? Maybe it's a combination of the two. Maybe it's more than that. Is osmolarity the driver, or is osmolarity the consequence of this? Is it, a tear film and ocular surface dysfunction? Are the tears unstable? Is there a loss of surface protection? What did the tears do? What's their function? Is it, inflammatory disease? Is it the Pflugfelder-Stern theory, promulgated by Allergan? Is inflammation secondary? It's the kind of thing where we go like, I don't know, is it meibomian gland dysfunction? What is it? What is it? And the answer is, it actually is, 2 separate disease states, which I'll share in, relatively straightforward detail, the majority of which fall into one category that you see variations of all the time. To better understand it, and I would not have done this, in 2015. I would use the DEWS definition, but I had more to complain about it because, I felt it was overly commercial. But Kelly Nichols insisted, and she was the chair of the definitions group, on including a sentence segment, which is critical. Dry is a multifactorial disease of the ocular surface characterized, and that's old, by, and this is new, a loss of homeostasis. And we'll talk about that in tremendous detail in a minute because it's the key to enlightenment. In which tear film instability, again, major issue because that's what, causes everything downstream from it. And then you see as a consequence hyperosmolarity, ocular surface inflammation, which occurs fairly early on. We'll talk about that. Ultimately damage and neurosensory abnormalities either in the efferent or the efferent aspect of neurosensory dysfunction. And all of that basically describes elegantly, beautifully what dry eye disease is. So we first have to go to homeostasis. A physician named Walter Cannon in 1930 wrote a book called The Wisdom of the Body. And he basically said, hey, when you go outside and it's cold, the blood drains to the core to keep you functioning. And if it's really cold and you don't maintain balance and function, then you start to shiver to generate heat from the muscles. And if you're in Arizona like I am and it starts getting really hot, you'll go out and you'll start, sweating, your peripheral vessels will dilate, your face will flush, and, the sweat will cause evaporative cooling. So the body, that's a simple example of homeostasis, this maintenance of balance. When we look at the eye, it's much more complex because the eye is so critical for survival. The brain is constantly monitoring the surface of the eye. We'll talk about that in a second. And it's taking this information, it's calculating what it needs to do. We have a number of things that can change. The rate of the blink, the force of the blink, the amount of meibum being produced, the amount of aqueous being produced, the type of aqueous being produced, the salt concentration of the aqueous, the gel-forming mucin concentrations, the different types of gel-forming mucins, the transmembrane mucin. I mean, I can go on for an hour, and it's adjusting these things constantly. It's a dynamic system. We don't recognize it, and it's constantly getting feedback. And when it falls out of balance, that's when patients start having issues. And this is completely centrally controlled with the exception of reflex tearing. That's the only thing that's an instantaneous reflex. Why? Because our ancestors, and you have to go back to the inception to understand it, our ancestors basically didn't have nail clippers, and they didn't have hand washing stations or hand sanitizer. So, they get a piece of volcanic ash in their eye, from the nearby volcano, and they stuck their finger in their eye, scratched their cornea, they were done for. So this is, an instantaneous thing. Wash things away before they can stick, but everything else is controlled by essentially the trigeminal nerve. And if you want food for thought, here's a simple question. You learned, as all of us did, Barry and I learned at SUNY, among many other things, like where to get eclairs. And just kidding about that. It is lunchtime, though. Why is the cornea the most heavily innervated tissue in the body? We learned that the cornea is the most heavily innervated tissue in the body. So you have a piece of dust in your eye? I mean, that doesn't make any sense. Why would nature go to the trouble of creating so many nerves in the cornea? And the answer is because those nerves serve a very important function. And when we talk about homeostasis, we're not just talking about the innervative aspects, the afferent and efferent aspects. We're talking about, vascular changes that can occur. We're talking about endocrine changes, hormonal changes. We know that's an area that's being investigated. And we also talk about the immune system. As I said before, inflammation kicks in fairly early. So let's make this simple as I throw the dog out of the room. Hold on one second. Can you go that way? Okay. My dog loves podcasts because it gives her an opportunity to annoy me. Lovely dog. Anyway, she's going stir crazy with me stuck at home too. Anyway, let's simplify. It's very simple. Here's a normal eye in a schematic form. And go back to the three component system of Wolf. We make lipid, we make aqueous, make mucin, completely fundamentally wrong. We make all of those things, and they're much more complex than he imagined, but he was the first person to recognize the complexity of the tear film. And what he didn't recognize is that it's completely under neurologic control. Each one of those elements interacts with another, so lipids up-regulated or down-regulated depending upon aqueous production and mucin production and environmental aspects, and that results ultimately in a stable tear film and normal function, and the patient can see well and avoid predators coming from a distance and forage for food and read their iPhone and interact with people, and they're comfortable and they forget they have eyes. And we think of this as a fixed thing. We measure tear production with Schirmer strips, which, to me is almost laughable when it's a dynamic, constantly evolving and changing thing. And here we have essentially what we call dry eye, what most of us call evaporative dry eye, but it's really what we call dry eye. And that is a failure to maintain homeostatic control. It starts out generally either from something endogenous or exogenous. It could be something that's intrinsic to the patient, like meibomian gland dysfunction, which could be due to excessive computer work, or it could be rosacea. Digital devices, obviously, the iPhone is about a dozen years old. That definitely didn't help. Accutane kills glands. Chemotherapy kills glands. Contact lenses blow the tear film up, ambient humidity changes, all these things factor in, and it destabilizes things. So the number one source of issues, as you'll see, is lipid production, lipid stability, and lipid volume, and how it interacts with the ocular surface and maintaining ocular surface stability, and everything else kind of interacts around that in modern times. That's our biggest weakness. And all of this leads to tear film instability, which ultimately evokes inflammation because the body wants to fix it, doesn't like doing it, but it does, and we suffer the consequences. Unstable vision, we're uncomfortable, and the patient's miserable. Then there's another group of patients that we see less of, but we do see them, and the image on the lower right, the dense staining, is very characteristic of that patient. Most of the other patients don't have staining, and the big question is, okay, why, does the FDA go crazy? Why do you have to show signs and symptoms when very often you'll see patients with profound symptoms and no signs at all? And the reason is, for many patients, although you do see signs in severe homeostatic failure, and homeostatic failure and primary inflammation can coexist. But here you have the patients who have autoimmune disease, and autoimmune disease eats the cornea and the lacrimal glands and the surface of the eye the same way it eats the joints of an arthritic person, or the skin of a person with scleroderma. It could be Sjogren's syndrome specific to the eye. It could be graft versus host. It could be rheumatoid arthritis, lupus. It could be nonspecific, minor. It could be disruptive, like fibromyalgia, unrelated to the eye directly, but anything that ramps up inflammation in the body can produce these similar symptoms to what we would call traditional dry eye. And these patients tend to be aqueous deficient because their lacrimal glands are attacked by inflammation. Completely different mechanism, to me, two different disease states, which is why they don't correlate. Now, we need to talk about a little bit of biochemistry and lipid chemistry. We think of lipids as kind of like a saran wrap covering to the ocular surface to prevent evaporation. And indeed it is, but it's much more complex than that. It's actually a two-phase with multiple species, hundreds of different species of lipids, polar and non-polar. The polar lipids, the phospholipids, look like water on one end and lipid on the other. The non-polar lipids just make a nice sheet that's relatively, not completely, moisture-proof, and it sticks to the polar lipids rather, and the polar lipids stick to the underlying primarily water component, the gel-forming mucin component, which is a viscoelastic coating. So I explained it to patients, and you may have seen this before if you've heard me lecture. I love this analogy. I tell patients, the problem is not that you have dry eye, it's you have plenty of tears. The problem is your tears aren't working. And then I explain that the tear film is structural in nature, at least the basal tear system is structural in nature, like a house with a foundation and a roof, and something in between. Some foundation is gel-forming mucins and microvilli, and the outer roof is primarily lipids, and viscoelastic center is made up of primarily aqueous and gel-forming mucins. And tear film stability is the whole issue. Now, everyone thinks, and this is important for understanding how to fix it, that every time someone blinks, a little lipid comes out. And that's completely and fundamentally wrong. Every time we blink, we pressurize the glands. And I'll prove that to you in a couple of seconds. It's almost like a bicycle pump. And the reason why, until the blink completes, the pressure remains constant. The pressure is released when the lower and upper lid touch, and the muscles of Reelin are relaxed. They serve as sphincters to maintain pressure within the glands. And the reason why is no entity, no supreme being, no force of nature would have created a completely on-check system for producing a critical component of the tear film. And the muscles of Reelin create a check valve so that a metered amount comes out every time we blink. So no matter how hard, how frequent, how infrequent you blink, you're getting the same metered amount, which is sufficient to coat the tear film, which occurs on upblink. And you can see here, the anatomy, the muscles of Reelin are at the very bottom portion of the Meibomian glands. And you'll see changes in the Meibomian glands caused by back pressure, and we'll talk about gland probing in a minute. And you can see that the tear film is very, very complex. So Donald Korb is one of the most wonderful gifts we've had in optometry, absolutely brilliant observationalist. In 1980, and this is the 40th anniversary, and I congratulate him and I wish him another 40 years of health and production, with Antonio Enriquez, wrote a seminal paper called Meibomian gland dysfunction and contact lens intolerance. He just scratched the surface with that. I won't dwell on it because of time, but he basically was the first to recognize what is essentially the cause of most of the misery and dysfunction relative to ocular surface that we interact with or we deal with today. And he subsequently wrote what I think is probably one of the most brilliant papers ever written, Dry Eye is the Wrong Diagnosis for Millions, with Carolyn Blackie, and I'm going to hopefully prove that. And he's not the only one to see that, certainly. We've come to appreciate that. This is almost an alternative to the Dew's, way of looking at things, and it's much less complex. It is the work of Christophe Baudouin, who's been around for a number of years, a very bright ophthalmologist from France, and he wrote this great article, The Proposed Vicious Circle, A Pathology of Dry Eye Disease, and he wrote an update to it as well. And you'll notice in the center of it is Meibomian gland dysfunction and related issues, which we'll talk about in some detail. So I will say this, and I think this is something you could take to the bank. Meibomian gland dysfunction and result in lipid insufficiency drive or exacerbate virtually all dry eye. I'm not talking about 86.9 or whatever LEMS number is. I was 86 point something. I was talking to Korb the other day, and I said, Donald, I think they got it wrong. I think it's 99.86, not the other way around. And he actually chuckled, which doesn't happen very often, but he did agree. So, okay, let's figure out how to find patients. Let's go find some patients. You have a practice, and you haven't had a forgiving, understanding wife who said, okay, when you said, I want to create a standalone dry eye practice within the practice. You have a primary care practice. You're looking to get back on your feet. You need something niche, that's going to be a big part of what we do. Actually, I'll be talking about that later tonight in a rather large webinar. What to do, how to get back. Dry eye is low-hanging fruit to medical eye care. Medical eye care is the future of optometry. I will tell you that right now. If you think refractive eye care is the future of optometry, you're on the wrong boat. That is not the future of optometry. In fact, this is going to exacerbate the change in optometry from a mix of refractive and medical to primarily medical. Have a technician, an assistant, someone administer a validated questionnaire. It could be an OSDI, the speed I like, the DEQ5, whatever it is you like. You can download these for free on the internet. Speed is readily available, as is the OSDI. Score it in front of the patient, review it with the patient, reaffirm the patient having dry eye symptoms, and I'm using dry eye loosely, so the patient says, okay, I know I got a problem, I'm going to deal with it, and the tech or the assistant says, I'm going to mention it to Dr. Epstein, and he will bring it up, and then during the examination, I've been apprised of it, and I will bring it up and address it and schedule an examination for dry eye specifically after the primary care examination. So essentially the essence of it is condensed into this one slide: patient interview and history, a number of specialized tests, and the best things we ever did when we opened the practice is we invested in specialized testing. You don't have to, and I'll go to Lens to explain how you can avoid it, but I would advise you to, and certainly all of us have slit lamps, and you can do an external exam quite easily, and then you can come up with a diagnosis and a plan. Number one, the single most important thing you have in your office when you're interacting with a patient is the patient. And I tell our externs all the time, residents when they come visiting, Shut up, listen to the patient. They'll tell you what's wrong. They'll tell you how to fix it. And they will. And I'll give you examples of it in a second. Always begin with, why are you here today? Or sometimes I'll begin with just going over the data. And I spend most of my time reviewing data and talking about the disease state. But in the end, one way or another, you have to try to understand what the patient's experience has been. What are they feeling? Is it burning? Is it irritated? Is it something that wakes them in the middle of the night? And each one of those things makes a difference. What makes them feel better? Have they seen other doctors? What have they done? What has failed? What has worked? So all of these things are important. So we bought an Oculus keratograph. It was one of the first pieces of equipment we bought. I love the machine. It is I call it the Porsche of our technology. Although we have a lot of technology now, I still love the keratograph. We use it more than any other instrument in the office. It is truly the Swiss Army knife of dry eye and also keratometry testing, non-invasive breakup time, Meibography, tear meniscus height, tear film skin, tear film dynamics. It measures there's a tear viscosity measure, which we're beginning to use more and more for research. Ocular redness assessment, which is great as we get into aesthetics more and more, and a lipid layer assessment, which is kind of rudimentary. We also have a LipiView 2, which I use for actual lipid layer thickness measurements, but extremely helpful, more for diagnosis and communication than for anything else. And I have a tech who goes through all of the testing. She flips the lids. She does Meibography. This is an out-of-pocket charge. It's an uncovered service. So it's an income generated for the practice. It differentiates us from other practices, and I've become quite the aficionado of analysis of glands, and it's an amazing communications tool. So remember I talked about how the glands remain sealed, and we've always talked about how the glands become convoluted and they twist and turn, and the reason why is because of back pressure. That doesn't just happen naturally, and sometimes you'll see the glands actually twisted into a ball, and that's because the eyes never release the pressure because the lids never close, because they're busy staring, because the person's staring at an iPhone or staring at a computer screen. We never fully close the lids, never release the muscles of reelin. So the glands stay under pressure, and after a while, a weak side bows, a strong side gets carried with it, and you end up with curvature and twisting and turning. And eventually what ends up happening is the oils stay resonant too long, they become rancid, and you end up with inflammation clearing away these rancid oils, and you can see the bottom arrow, the haze, that's inflammatory cells rushing into remove all of these stagnant oils, and eventually you begin to lose gland tissue. And you can see this is a very inflamed eye, particularly at the bottom. Some structure remains. The upper, you can see that convoluted, skinny, burnt out gland look. Here's an example of something even a little bit worse. Still have some gland tissue. You can see at the bottom the glands seem to be split. We call that tooth sign, again because of back pressure. And if you do meibomian gland probing, as of a la Maskin, anyone who's done it knows that when you first break through, you'll hear a pop, and the reason why is because the glands are indeed under pressure. The second part of the Oculus that I absolutely love is non-invasive breakup time, because patients get it. I explain that this is a sort of a surrogate for tear film stability, and patients get green is good and red is bad. And I explain this is like a roof of a house, and if the tear film is unstable, there's going to be a lot of evaporation. The tear film is going to become increasingly toxic because of concentration, and after a while, actually, you begin to get surface damage. Patients get this, so we aim for improvement, and this is great for the diagnosis as well as quantifying what you're going to do over time. Probably the most valuable diagnostic and communications tool I have in the office by far. And also the topography element is excellent as well. It does this nice 3D topography image, which is great for patients who've had LASIK and they have structural changes, topographic changes, which contribute to evaporation and poor tear wiping. Slit lamp, critically important. In fact, we're waiting on some new HOGs coming, and that's the next thing you go to. The reason why I have this young lady, a picture I took at Woodstock, no, I didn't take this at Woodstock, although I was at Woodstock, I admit it. The reason I put it there is because you look at her and you say, well, she's a nice, cute kid, but if you notice, she's sleeping with her eyes open, and that's something that occurs in anywhere from 30 to 40, maybe even a little higher percent of patients. You don't even have to look. They'll tell you if you ask them or you listen to them, and they'll say, I wake up in the morning, I can barely get my eyes open, and they're like sandpaper, or I can't go to bed at night without putting a bottle of artificial tears on the nightstand, because if I get up, I can't even get my eyes open. I have to wet my eyes. And the reason why is they're not closing. They have lag ophthalmos or incomplete closure. Now, that's not that unusual, and I'll show you in a second. This is a classic example of a patient coming in the morning typically, because this will heal over time. By late afternoon, early evening, you won't even see the staining pattern because it'll have resolved. But if you see the staining pattern, it's almost always exposure, sometimes toxic stuff, but that is in a sense exposure. These are patients who have a poor Bell's, and here's how you measure a Bell's: hold the upper lids, have them close their eyes forcefully, eyes shoot up and out. A lot of patients don't have competent Bell's, but babies very often sleep with their eyes open. And as I was describing this to a patient, it kind of hit me over the head like a brick. And I realized that, oh, wait a minute, we have all these babies. Moms come in and say, like babies sleep with their eyes open, they're possessed. I go, okay, cool. Yep. I think that's the diagnosis: baby possessed. ICD 7081902 DP. Baby possessed. And they go, no, well, is it bad? And I go, not. Google says it's fine, and if you search on Google, lots of babies sleep with their eyes open. Moms never come in complaining that the baby has dry eye. And the reason why is they have very stable tear film. So tear film instability will lead to nighttime exposure symptoms. I think patients do sometimes have poor closure and don't complain because they really have very stable tear films. So it's another way of diagnosing poor tear film quality or poor tear film stability. Always look at the lids, externally as well as with a slit lamp, and there's a wealth of information. Telangiectatic vessels. This patient has ocular rosacea. Great patient for IPL. You have lenses. There's a lot of evaporative dry eye. There's a contact lens in there. It's tightened on. A lot of inflammation, plugged glands. They have blepharitis. So this person, they got a lot of stuff going on. Saponification, I'll talk about in detail because it's important. We overlook it all the time. It's caused by lipase breaking down lipids, mixing with salt, producing soaps, and soaps burn, and that's one of the reasons why patients go, my eyes are burning. Use your fingertips wisely, my son and daughters. So what do I mean by that? When I say use your fingertips wisely, if you do diagnostic expression by pressing lightly, not hard, you don't want to squeeze something out, you just want to get the glands to empty. We're using the approximate amount of force that an eyelid will create during a blink. And here you can see nice, clear, pristine meibum coming out. And you do this on normals, and eventually you'll calibrate your own finger. Or you can use an MGE by Tear Science, which is calibrated for you with the force, approximate force of the blink invented by Corbin Blackie. But I use my fingertip because I never forget to bring it with me into an exam room. Tear film breakup time using fluorescein, very important, very different than non-invasive breakup time. If you get breakup over the same area over and over again, it means that the surface is non-wetting over that area due to chronicity. And if you get breakup sporadically in different areas, it means that there's insufficient lipid. Either way, it means that the tear film is unstable, and generally the patient is headed for symptoms if they don't already have them. Sometimes patients will come in and they are in serious trouble. This is an example of someone who has very, very severe inflammatory eye disease, as well as an inability to maintain any restorative balance. And you can see the macro SPK and just how terrible the surface is. That cornea is in terrible shape. We see conjunctival staining as well. So the key here in managing dry eye, if you want to be successful, is restore a stable, intact tear structure. It's really that simple. I know you can spend a fortune going to different programs and they'll tell you all kinds of things. It's very simple. You don't have to spend anything. Restore a stable tear structure. I'll tell you how to do it. First thing, recognize that this is a cause and effect situation like everything else in life. Nothing happens by accident. Everything happens for a reason. So all of the patient's symptoms, the misery, the discomfort, the tearing, the redness, the irritation, the surface damage, they're all effects. And that's where we play, unfortunately. We treat the effects. We give them anti-inflammatory drugs. We give them wetting drops. We give them warm compresses. We do this, we do that, but we don't ever treat the cause. What are the causes? Meibomian gland dysfunction caused by changes in diet and changes in visual tasking. Staph overgrowth, a natural occurrence, often associated with a change in the microbiome because of MGD. Lacrimal insufficiency, and there are other underlying causes. But if we treat the causes, if we can identify the causes and begin to treat them, then we really make significant progress. I'm not going to go into this. In fact, if anybody wants it, if they could send me an email that says Oculus dry eye, those three words, Oculus space, dry space, eye space, I'll be glad to send you this as well as my patient questionnaire. You'll notice I break it into 1 and 2 as I did before. One is failure to maintain homeostatic control, run-of-the-mill, every day, you see it in your office, dry eye. And 2 is inflammatory dry eye, which is really, to me, an entirely different animal, not that the two can overlap. Every patient leaves with an instruction sheet. This is the current one that we're using right now. You can see what I use and what I don't use. Not everybody gets everything, obviously. I don't prescribe Cequa and Xiidra for patients at the same time. I do occasionally prescribe Doxy as well as a nutritional, but all of these things make a big difference. I'm going to go through them in detail. Number 1, triglyceride-based omega-3, critically important. Not all fish oils are the same. You want a triglyceride-based omega-3 with a minimum 3-to-1 EPA to DHA ratio. There are 2 products that meet that criteria. One of them is PRN-D3. Excuse me, I should have updated the slide. It's a little old. PRN-D3. And the other one is Nordic Naturals EPA Extra. Nordic Naturals EPA Extra, which is about a 4-to-1 EPA to DHA ratio. The DREAM study, I don't know if I have the DREAM slide, showed that triglyceride-based omega-3 with a 2-to-1 didn't work any better than olive oil. Terribly designed study. Wonderful people conducting it and participating in it, but not well done. I'm not a big fan of other products. I'm certainly not a big fan of Nature Made or Costco or whatever. Tried it, been there, done it, didn't work. I will tell you, a 3-to-1 or greater is disruptive, life-changing for patients. One thing to take on a desert island with dry eye patients, it would be that. Number 2, the second most under-recognized cause of tear film instability is changes in the flora or the microbiome associated with meibomian gland dysfunction, causing an overproduction of toxins, exotoxins. Staph want to maintain their dominance in an area, so normal flora produce toxins to keep other things from growing, and they also produce digestive enzymes, among them lipase, collagenase, protease, and so on. Lipase is particularly nasty because not only does it break through skin and cause big ulcers and things of that sort and actually eat your entire arm when you have necrotizing fasciitis, but lipase also breaks down lipid in the tear film, which is the stabilizing outer layer of the tear film, mixes with salt, makes soap, causes burning and irritation, and also further digests that lipid layer, creating further tear instability. And this is literally right out of the book of Baudouin, right from the center of Baudouin's I guess, algorithm for how dry eye occurs. And it's absolutely spot on and brilliant. Don't underestimate how much gunk can accumulate on lids. This lid is, not only does the patient have ocular rosacea covered with gunk, but there's enough staph to kill a small army. Hypochlorous acid is the answer. There's a number of companies that make it. I'll share my thoughts in a second. Reduces bacterial overpopulation, inactivates the toxins very effectively, gets rid of pro-inflammatory mediators, so it's actually anti-inflammatory. It also kills COVID virus, by the way, so your contact lens wearers that are using sclerals or want to wear soft lenses, and I don't know why anyone would be wearing a 2-week or a monthly soft lens at this point, when they can have a daily disposable, but it kills, it sterilizes cases very, very effectively. And for the dry eye patient, degrades and blocks disruptive enzymes like lipase. The way I have patients use it, hold it right out in front of their face, about a foot away. If they have rosacea, maybe a little further to spray it on cheeks as well. Close their eyes, spray, look up, flutter for a couple of seconds, close their eyes, put their head down, count to 10, and then rosacea, wipe it on their face and nose, let it air dry. If they don't have rosacea, they can wipe it away with a tissue. I have them do it twice. So this has evolved, by the way. I first got involved when Avenova was introduced for necrotizing fasciitis. It was actually called Nutriphase, and the daughter of the inventor, Rhonda Jaffe, was an ophthalmologist and said, hey, this will be useful for blepharitis. She kind of missed the boat on meibomian gland dysfunction, and it works brilliantly. The problem is actually, I forgot the name of the company. What is it? Novabeg. It's right in front of me. Novabeg was very hard to deal with. They kept raising prices and doing crazy stuff. So I use HighClear, www.gethighclear.com. Stabilized, open bottle, lasts for 1.5 years, much less expensive, and only sold through OD practices. Patient control is very important. Same exact thing, have them spray it directly on their face. Donald Corb's blinking exercise is critically important. Everybody gets it. You can get a copy of the printed material off the internet, or I have it, and you can get an iTunes or an iPhone app. RX, should you be using RX medications? Absolutely. When you first get started in doing this, for sure. And a significant percentage of my patients are on RX medications, not all of them, maybe 40%. Xiidra's my preferred. Cequa is coming up from behind very quickly. I'm surprised at how well it's working. Lotemax has to be used with caution, as is the case with all steroids. It's not a chronic use medication. I've not had good success with non-preserved steroids. Just they haven't really worked very well, and I'm not a big fan of Restasis. I think its concentration is a little too low, but some patients are on it. I don't take them off it if they're happy with it. But remember that these are all anti-inflammatories. You're playing on the big cog after the problem is occurring, and the goal really would be to ultimately get people off of this. And these inflammatory variants, this works for inflammation in group 1, the run-of-the-mill dry eye, because inflammation is part of homeostatic control. So when patients are very symptomatic or they have mild staining, I'll go to Cequa or Xiidra rather, or Cequa at this point, and depending on a number of different factors, which are too extensive to get into here. When the patients come in and they clearly have rheumatoid arthritis or Sjogren's or lupus or whatever, I always use an anti-inflammatory, and I will use a steroid if I need to, but I don't use it excessively. Here's something that is worth its weight in gold. When patients have exposure, that needs to be treated, or they'll forever be miserable. iEco makes some really good products. We use the iSeals 4.0 a lot. It's the only product that actually seals the eyes. It's a silicone-based mask, sticks to the eyes, does very nicely. More recently, I've rediscovered vitamin A, but this time in the form of a paraffin-based ointment. You cannot buy it in the U.S. directly. You have to have the patients order it through Amazon or eBay. It's about $8 not a vial, a squeeze tube, I guess you'd call it, and it's called Vita POS, Vita POS. I tried to get it from Ursa Farm, and they said, Danke Shane, no, go to hell. We can't send it because paraffin is not part of the list of approved products for over-the-counter use in the United States, but it's available in Canada, and as I said, go on Amazon or go on eBay, and it is game-changing. Patients absolutely love it. In fact, my young associate has patients use it sometimes during the day. It creates a nice tight shield for lipid-deficient patients. Vitamin A is restorative in and of itself, and it usually lasts not too much, just a small dollop, maybe a millimeter at most in the lower cul-de-sac at night. Close your eye, let it melt. Paraffin is not like petrolatum, like lacquer, which just gets all over the place and is disgusting. Actually, this video won't play. You need to debride the lids. If I'm just doing casual debrider, I invented a debrider with a safety button, Mediarix. I make nothing from it. I know Barry will say, what the hell is wrong with you? But I don't, but it actually works very well and it's very safe. But I like BlephX and I like AB Max. Both are excellent tools. The two guys are fighting with each other. AB Max has a slight advantage, and that's a pulse mode. BlephX has been around for years. AB Max is less expensive. BlephX is more expensive. Both are good instruments, so I recommend them both, and I use them always before I do debridement, or for debridement rather, before I treat with advanced expression devices. And I have all of these, and I love Lipifor. I've been using it for many years. It transformed my practice. If you anticipate being a high volume practice and you're willing to make the investment, Lipifor is great. My tech does it. I have relatively little involvement in it. TearCare is phenomenal. The people who put it together are old friends of mine, so I am biased for their success. I want to see them successful. It's a great device. Tremendous amount of technology. Those things stick on the lids, and it has a clearance assistant, which is probably the best design. I have a Expressor, and theirs is better than mine. Just very, very well done, and you get the hang of it. You get really good at it. And iLux, we have actually newfound respect for it. At first I thought it was a total waste, but iLux actually is not that bad, especially if you're doing IPLs, which is my next and getting to the end topic. So IPL for ocular rosacea, game changer, literally game changer. My wife wanted to have me committed when I told her what we paid for it and that I had brought it in. After the first couple of months I was traveling, I didn't have a chance to really implement it. And she said, is this going to be another stair climber? And I said, no, sweetie, I'm not going to be hanging my clothes on it. And we use this. We typically do, under normal circumstances, anywhere from, I'll do typically 24 a Friday. So Friday is my day. The reason why we schedule them 15 minutes apart, unbelievable improvement in dry eye signs and symptoms. There's collateral improvement in skin tone quality. That's not, my focus. Arizona is very specific. Don't screw with the skin. You're there for treating dry eye, and I get that. But certainly, if they get collateral benefits, I'm not arguing, and neither are the patients. It desaturates meibum. It appears to break carbon bonds. There's a process called photobiomodulation, well recognized in dermatology literature. And what it does is it stimulates the gland activity on a cellular basis, on a cellular component basis, specifically mitochondria. It also kills Demodex, kills bacteria, decreases inflammation. I thought, frankly, it was too good to be true. It was promoted by Rolando Toyos, who's, is a bigger than life kind of ophthalmologist. So I was very wary of it, and it is over-delivered. It is not an island unto itself. Sometimes it has to be used with expression, but I certainly am doing more IPLs than I'm doing expression, and patients just absolutely love it. No difficulty in getting patients to sign on for it. So I wanted to just share very quickly when I use IPL, when I use LipiFlow or tear care, and that's generally if the patient is doing well with traditional simple therapies, and all the signs as well as their symptoms have gotten much better. Glands are stable. Over time, they're not losing glands. Glands seem more functional. I'm kind of happy to wait and see if they're happy to wait and see. Sometimes patients want more. Sometimes I think they need more. And then I have to decide between photomodulation and regeneration, which is IPL, or is this primarily obstructive disease? And if you remove obstruction, basically it sends a message through the trigeminal nerve, nasociliary branch up to the brain and says, hey, we're not making enough lipid. Turn on the lipid. The brain turns on the lipid. You start producing more lipid, and the glands become more functional. When we treat it with IPL, it basically creates additional function through direct activity on the glands. So you have to decide which one makes the most sense. And when patients have low lipid levels, but the lipids are healthy looking and decent looking, and I can do that using interferometry, which we have. But if you're getting like almost nothing coming out, expression may make the most sense. Although, as I said before, IPL does help with expressivity as well. And if you're, have a patient where they're producing lipids, but the lipids really aren't good quality and they have a little bit of staining and they're uncomfortable, then, IPL makes more sense, So again, give that some thought and integrate that into your own thinking. Stuff I don't use very much, punctal plugs, almost never. Why? Because it's not dry eye. Like I said, listen to the patient, stupid. Listen, it's not dry eye, stupid. It's not that you're not making enough tears. I don't need to keep more of the stuff you're not making enough of in the eye. It's that the tears aren't working. Punctal plugs don't help. In fact, if anything, they do the opposite, and the body compensates for that anyway. Androgens, Alan Panzer in Houston is a big proponent of testosterone. I've not had good results with it. I've tried, some people have. I haven't completely abandoned it. Autologous serum, we don't use as much. We use amniotic fluid. Non-preserved topical steroids, I've kind of abandoned. But amniotic fluid, amniotic membrane, true tear, especially for patients that are post-LASIK. Bandage lens, absolutely, and scleral lenses. Bandage lenses, never say never. We were taught that contact lenses create additional risk for patients. Yeah, absolutely. Everything creates additional risk. These days, going outside creates additional risk. However, if the benefits exceed the potential harm from taking that risk, then as long as the patient understands it, you do it. So you have to inform consent the patient, give them your cell phone number. They have really dense staining. A bandage lens will get them back to life and reduce the staining, break the cycle of staining while you're working to make things back to normal again. And we've weaned patients off bandage lenses. It's an inexpensive, simple way. that has to be applied cautiously, can make a significant difference. Scleral lenses are absolutely game-changing. If you're not using scleral lenses now, you should be using sclerals. Barry is a master of sclerals, far more than I am. My wife is just phenomenal at it. And you should be using something like a Pentacam or an OCT to fit them. I'm not a big fan of Fluorescein fitting simply because I see the train wrecks that come in who have been fit that way. I'm not saying you can't do it. You probably can, and some people are skilled at it, but being able to fit with technology really makes a difference, especially the Pentacam is a phenomenal, in fact, it's almost automated fitting, autopilot fitting. NOCT for the skilled user is also very, very helpful. Why does sclerals work so well? For me, it's the end of the line. It's, when I'm not able to get them back into anything else, I will always, go to sclerals, or if the patient's very active and a camper or a hiker, sclerals make sense. So there's always reasons, why we use sclerals. The reason why is it completely isolates the ocular surface from the environment, and it does, a perfect job of doing it, especially with modern materials. So anyway, I hope that was useful. I know it's very rapid fire. Again, if you have any questions that need further answering more than we can answer now, Art Epstein at Gmail, and it should say Oculus space dry space eye space, and forgive me for making a point of that, but otherwise it'll get lost in my email, and I'd be glad to send you any materials I have. Barry,
Okay, wow.
I am here for you. I told you I get through
Thank
it.
you, Art. Well, first of all, you did get through it, and very good timing. And I apologize. I've been seeing some comments that we're having some audio issues. I'm not hearing any of that on my end, unfortunately. It came out pretty well. So I do apologize. We'll be addressing that for future webinars. So let's get into a few questions, both from the audience and some thoughts that I had. So let's start out with one that I find interesting. It's kind of multifactorial, if that's okay, Art. So you emphasize tear film instability throughout your talk. So what ways can the instability of the tear film influence our diagnostic test results? In consideration of this, how should we perform them and interpret them properly in terms of osmolarity, in terms of non-invasive tear breakup time, and also let me jump on top of that in terms of the negative impact on vision quality that dry eye has, especially in terms of stability, and what are some of the best ways you use to evaluate the impact of dry eye on vision and vision stability?
So, no, that's a great question, Mary. It really is. And again, my goal is to simplify. I'm a simplifier. In fact, years ago, I had a conversation with Milton Hahn. He wanted to write textbooks and, do clinical studies. And, I have some interest. I've written a number of chapters. But my main thing is taking the complex and trying to, make it as simple as possible so I can understand it and so our colleagues can understand it. So, I don't want to overcomplicate tear film stability. Tear film stability happens when everything's working properly. So you're 100% right. An unstable tear film, they're going to suffer visual consequences. An unstable tear film is going to make it difficult for even a surgeon, for example, to get base calculations for IOL. And so, we have to do everything we can to recognize tear film instability and to correct it. And you have to go to the meaning of what the word is. Now, if you have a low level tear film, let's say your aqueous deficient at some level, and you have a reasonably competent lipid level, and the tear film is stable, it's stable. The patient's going to see the way they're going to see, and your measurements are going to be relatively consistent. On the other hand, if you have a normal amount of tears and maybe a very thin lipid layer so that it's constantly breaking up, the tear film becomes very unstable because there's areas that evaporate and it becomes thin in areas. So the tear film becomes unstable, vision becomes compromised, measurements become compromised. So that becomes an issue. So, to me, look at the basic ingredients of what makes a tear film stable. So what do you need for, what's the magic potion? Enough lipid or enough material for the glands to produce enough meibum to create an adequate lipid layer. And those are omega-3s, free fatty acids. We don't produce them in our bodies. We don't synthesize them, so we have to take them in as part of our foods. Our grandparents or great-grandparents, when they came over from, Mother Russia or Mother Romania in my mom's family's case, they came from farms, farmland, and they, ate beef that ate grass, they ate fish that were caught in lakes and streams, filled with rich in omega-3s. That's Shannon calling in to say hey. Anyway, we don't have that anymore. Everything is processed. Fish are farmed with omega-6s, and it's just kind of the nature of the beast. So we need to make sure that they have enough omega-3s. We need to make sure the tear film is stable. We need to address staph overpopulation on the lids, and all of those things contribute to increasingly stable tear film. I hope that answered your question.
That was great. Thank you so much. I want to bring up a question. There's actually a few questions from the audience, all on the concept of IPL. I always find that we as optometrists really often jump on new technologies, probably faster than other fields of healthcare, and sometimes maybe to our own fault, that we kind of get all overexcited about one thing. But I've heard so much positive in terms of the IPL. On the other hand, there are some potential complications from IPL, like pigmentary changes, especially on dark-skinned individuals. That was brought up. So can you address some of the downsides or some of the cautions in IPL?
Yes, and that's a great question. I'm glad it was asked. There are a number of manufacturers that make IPL units, and I'm, my original thing, I don't even know if we ever had this conversation. We probably should have. My original direction was electrical engineering. So, when I first applied to college, it was as a double E, and so I'm very engineering focused. So, and I'm very tech focused. I've built a lot of radio equipment. I'm a ham. All that kind of nonsense. But so, I'm very cognizant of different engineering. I'm also a New Yorker, so just like you, I think everything's a scam, and extremely suspicious of everything. So, when IPL first became, fairly heavily promoted, I was very wary and very suspicious. And I waited for the science to evolve. Also looked at the dermatologic science. So I was reasonably certain that there was some value. I wasn't sure the depth or the extent of the value, but I felt that there would be some value, particularly from my patients with significant rosacea. From a mechanical or electronic or design implementation point of view, we use Luminous. Luminous is an Israeli company, and Israelis, for those of you who don't know, Israelis over-engineer things. They are very serious about the stuff they build, whether it's weapon systems or it's technical electronics. And the M22 Optima IPL is an example of that. This thing is beautifully engineered. Unlike other companies that make garbage, and you can buy them on eBay, they produce square waves. So the top of the wave is flat. The amount of energy, and light is nothing more than an envelope for energy. So the amount of the energy that's being conveyed to the tissue can be broken into bite-sized pieces. In some cases, 2 pulses. In some cases, 3 pulses. So you end up with, in the case of a Toyos approach for dry eye, you'll end up with 3 square waves, absolutely flat top, and so very carefully controlled energy distribution. So all the stuff you see online, the burns and all the other stuff, it just doesn't happen. And we've done hundreds of them with negligible, negative effects. I mean, we had one woman who had a buried suture that had a little discomfort, a small welt developed that was transient and disappeared. And that was really the worst of it. I think most of the bad stuff comes from the dermatologic literature where people were using garbage, basically. And in this case, you really get what you pay for. So it's a distribution of energy that has to be done intentionally and carefully. To my knowledge, I think Luminous was the first to introduce the product in the world, and this is their 6th or 7th generation product. So it's very, very well refined. And I'm one of the things that comes along with being a New Yorker is I'm very cognizant of being sued. Because if you literally walk out the door, to do anything, you get sued in New York. So I was, and thankfully I've knock on glass, I've never been sued, but I'm aware of that, and so I approach this with tremendous caution, and I'm very comfortable and very confident in it now. And in terms of results, mind-numbing. I mean, patients literally cry in the office, life-changing effects. It's extremely, extremely effective, and it's perfect for optometry as long as your state board permits it.
Okay, that's a great Long-winded answer, Art.
It was long-winded. It was.
That's great. Well, actually, let's do our, I think we have time for another question, and I think it's a takeoff of what you mentioned. And I want to make a comment here. One of the things that I was so impressed about your talk is your emphasis on the basic tenets of care. And those basic tenets don't require all this fancy-dancy equipment. It's nice to have. It may be something that most of us might end up referring out for, and there's nothing wrong within optometry to refer to somebody else in our own profession who perhaps more specializes in these areas. I'm sure you agree. That being said, so again, thank you for emphasizing the basics of nutrition and dealing with the bacterial flora and things like that. But we know that with these advanced technologies in MGD management, like the automated expression, IPL, they're currently not covered under medical insurance plans, and they have significant costs both for acquisition to eye care practitioners and obviously to the patient as out-of-pocket expenses. We also know that many of the treatments, especially some of the expression treatments, work best, at least from my experience, when applied to mild to moderate cases versus more advanced cases with significant meibomian gland atrophy and so on and so forth. And these patients may not be as highly symptomatic, or maybe they're not even symptomatic at all. So the question, and it was posed by our attendees as well as myself, how do we present these treatments to patients knowing that repeated treatments will be likely an ongoing expense when there's a mismatch between symptoms and perhaps even your findings?
So no, great. That's a great question, and so I'll give you a couple of coordinated responses. First of all, people are ultimately responsible for their own care, and believe me, I'm the first person to tell you that I think we should have a safety net in this country where everyone gets access to reasonable health care at some level. And, like Australia, is a good example of a system that I think works. Our system, works, but doesn't really work as well as it should. That said, there are some things that unfortunately are uncovered. They're uncovered for all of us. So, and one of the problems we have as optometrists is optometric guilt, and you've probably heard me, make this joke. You have Catholic guilt, and you have Jewish guilt, and then you have, optometric guilt. And the Catholic guilt, my friends that I grew up with were Catholic. They were going to hell anyway, so they either, were sad about it, or they went crazy because they're going to hell anyway. And then Jewish guilt, no matter what I do, it's never good enough. The typical Jewish guilt. And then optometric guilt is, what can I give you for free today? It's like I'm Mrs. Smith. You need a very complex thing. I can't charge you. I have to give it to you for free. So we have this tremendous amount of difficulty charging people for valuable things that we're able to give them, life-changing things that we're able to give them. So we price things reasonably. We exist because we make money in doing what we do, and in order to make money in doing what we do, we have to be paid for it like any other business. And so I have no qualms about charging people, for procedures and processes where I've invested a significant amount of money in the technology where it's helpful. Our fees, I think, are quite reasonable. I mean, to your point, you don't need all of this. And in fact, God bless the colleagues who refer to me and, keep the practice active and keep me getting better and better through increased experience with more and more complex patients. We have a cornea group that sends their train wrecks. We have, a major well-known institute that sends their train wrecks because they don't have the time or, maybe the intensity of focus that, that I do. I want the train wrecks, and if they're really a good train wreck, I'll learn from them, and then I'll get better for the next train wreck. So agree 100% about referrals. For most of our colleagues, using an omega-3, providing it to the patient, making a little money from it, absolutely fine. Using their fingertip to make the diagnosis and a slit lamp, having them come back for an extra visit, additional income, fair to the patient, some insurance coverage, absolutely makes sense. Referring to a colleague that has invested in this, who really wants to develop the expertise, that's the future of optometry. We need to work together. This is a pressure test for our profession. Some things have not worked very well, and some things have worked reasonably well. One of the things that I think we need to focus on is how we can work together as a community to help one another to continue to grow and dominate. I'm very proud of many of our colleagues that have basically suffered, shut down their offices, to not see routine patients, to keep the community safe, but yet are going in at some risk to provide emergency care for their communities. It's all part of, I guess, giving back. And this is an area where I think, that's very, very apparent. You can be really good at this, and you can give back, and you can build it for yourself as well.
That's a fabulous way to respond to that, and I hope everybody took note. With that, we've come to the end of our time this evening. There were a bunch of fabulous questions that we didn't have time to address. Art, maybe you can look over those and somehow figure a way to get some of them answered and share. Perhaps we can talk to the folks at Oculus on how to do that, because it'd be a little bit criminal not to answer some of these great questions. So we'll look into that. So with that, I want to thank you so much, Art, for your time and expertise. Of course, we want to thank Oculus and realize that these will be archived. These webinars will be archived on the Oculus website at some point. And also, we invite you to attend the next 2 dry eye related webinars, which will occur tomorrow evening and Thursday evenings. And it'll be my pleasure once again to moderate those. And you're going to be exposed to, as I mentioned to you at the beginning, some of the best and brightest in this field. We're all very, very lucky. And I know I learned a lot this evening. So thank you, Art. And with that, we will say, have a good evening.
Thank you, Barry, and thank you, Oculus, and thank all of you for tuning in. And stay safe, and we'll see you at a meeting in the future.
Bye-bye, everybody.